Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I know we have a few people trickling in, and that is totally fine, but we are going to go ahead and get started because we want to make sure that we use the best of our time today with all of these great folks who are joining us. My name is Ann Catherine Taylor, and I serve as the Interim Director of College Counseling. And today we have some very lovely people here to share their expertise about the landscape of college admissions. And I'll introduce them in just a second, but I just want to thank y'all for coming. I know that tonight the weather is a little crazy, but I also want to thank all of the parents of boarding students who are listening. But I especially want to thank all of you. So I'll go ahead and introduce, just kind of going down the line. First, we have Clay Alexander, and Clay is the Director of First-Year Recruitment at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And then we have Bran Stilley, who is the Vice President for Enrollment at Wofford College. And then we have Jason McGrath, the Associate Provost and Director of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And then we have Eva Bermesco, and she is the Director of University Scholars and the Honors College Associate Director at George Mason University. So we will go ahead and get started. Okay. Let's see. Well, I'm going to use this. Okay, so first question, this will work, this is fine. How can parents best partner with their students? So if you could explain how they can achieve a good balance between a student-led process but with adult support. And have you seen this work well or maybe not so well? And could you give an example of that?
I once heard the process of sending your child to college was like teaching them to drive. My oldest is a freshman in college now, but in the scenario where you're teaching your child to drive, your job is to sit quietly in the passenger seat and only grab the wheel unless when someone is about to get hurt. Other than that, let your child make a few mistakes along the way. Things don't have to be perfect, but only sort of jump in to save them when something really has gone wrong. I know that at a place like Baylor, they have great support here. Having an event like this is a great start to the college search process, or certainly a great milestone along the way. And I thought that was an interesting comparison when I heard it years ago. And I have to say that it's easier said than done, having gone through it with a child. I'll say, I also have a senior in high school. My son is a freshman. My daughter is a senior in high school. If you have sons and daughters, you know there can be differences in just managing two different children. So that's another consideration, I think, as well.
Some, I think, pretty easy to put into practice kind of tips that I like to recommend is designating a time of the week to do college things or talk about college things. It can really become all-consuming. It can seem like the only thing you're ever talking about these days. And kind of keeping it for a specific time, that way you know you're going to get to it and it doesn't start seeping into every single conversation. That tends to ratchet everybody's stress level up a little bit. And I think, you know, as the people who know your students best, definitely, let them be the drivers, of the process, but think about their strengths and weaknesses. There's a ton of administrative tracking and work that goes into this process that isn't the essay writing or the, campus visits or the list building. And so if you can help, take some of the deadline and date and registering things kind of off their plate, be the administrative assistant, that is a huge service. And feel free to outsource that if you have a, kind of bossy younger child that's still in the house. Give them a fun job. But doing that can give them a little bit more energy to focus on some of the kind of higher order thinking tasks that go into this project too.
We said we wouldn't say something every single time, I promise. But so similar, my oldest is a first year in college. My younger son is a junior in high school. And I would just, everything that you've heard, I echo, and I would just add that be prepared for how different these searches can feel. The relationship can be very different. My older son, and I think he'd be okay with me saying this, you know, it was more work to help him through the process. He needed more kind of coaching, more not hand-holding, but just more encouragement to keep it moving. There'd be stops and starts. It's like we get this great conversation at their time and their schedule, and I know that, like, it's been too long since we talked the last time about this, and so finding that way to say, hey, when do you want to talk again? And meanwhile, my younger son is asking me questions all the time. He's really into this process, and it's almost hard to get him to kind of pace himself a little bit. He likes too many schools because he can't figure out, he just likes the college process. So I think just being mindful that whatever you may have learned, if you've been through this once, or you've talked to people who've been through it, be prepared for it to feel very different perhaps the second time through, and just be okay with that, because they're just going to be, everyone's at a different place at a different point in time.
Yeah, I'll just echo encourage, support, kind of stand in the back, but be there, be present, and then help them be mindful of the important pieces, things that they may need to be aware of as you've been doing your own research and exploration. If there's something you catch, just see if they're aware and have an awareness for something you deem to be very important. But you should be involved. We don't want you to think you should not be involved. You should be involved, and hopefully we do a good job of making you involved and communicating with you as well. So I think if it's questions you have that relate to your part of the process, financial aid, scholarships, paying the bill, that sort of thing, certainly don't hesitate to engage with us and ask.
Okay, so we all know that college rankings have become a thing in the world of college admissions. We actually have a session on this tonight, so if you want to learn more about how the college rankings are formed, you should attend. But if you were making your own college rankings, what would be important to you? What would be on that list?
I thought about this one. The rankings that would be important to me would be the rankings that are on the items that are of most interest to me. So if it's the academic realm, what are the rankings? What are the strengths of that particular academic program? If it's involvement, extracurricular activities, if it's support and resources that I may need, how does that school rank, or what do they advertise as having in terms of resources? So whatever those rankings may be, eyeball the rankings that are most important to you. I will tell you, rankings come from folks in our institutional data offices where they're just crunching numbers, and they may not always relate. The one I hate the most is retention rankings. There are reasons students come and go, and very good reasons, and sometimes they don't paint a true picture. At the same time, graduation rates, maybe graduation rates in the academic programs of study, but don't let rankings be the sole proprietor of why you're making decisions about where you go, because rankings can be very relative, and sometimes they just may not paint a true picture of that particular institution as well.
So I'm doing the ranking session, so I don't know how much I should say right now. But Clay's invited to be a guest lecturer at our session. I think the main message, though, here is that figure out what matters to your student, and then investigate those things in schools that perform well in those areas. That's really what it comes down to. And so when I think about that, I have to remind myself that what I think to ask on a college visit is not what my son might be thinking about to ask. I might be thinking, what kind of access to faculty will they have? Maybe they prefer to have a bigger classroom because they want to be in the background. They don't want small classes. Maybe that just matters to me. So again, remember as you go through this, think about what really matters to the person who's going to be going to school. But I do think collectively, most of us are very aware on our campuses now the importance of kind of well-being, student wellness. And so especially if there's distance from home, I think that's something I would keep in mind is sort of what are the supports for students if there's going to be a distance from you, how easy is it for them to get two people to support them when life happens? So that would be one thing I would kind of put out there. That's a hard thing to rank, but it's something that I would want to evaluate a little bit and ask some questions about.
Okay. So a lot has changed in the world post-COVID, and that is not excluding the world of college admissions. So what are some things that you have noticed, and maybe this is specific to your institution or just in general, what has changed in the landscape of college admissions?
Well, I think the biggest change, which is, kind of still in effect, moving, it's continuously changing, is the testing requirements at a whole host of schools. Students have a lot more options in the test optional category than they did pre-2020. What's become more difficult is understanding how a school regards a score optional or test optional applicant. And I think we all learn a little bit more about that every time decisions come out. But I also, at least from the student side, things that I'm noticing as I read their applications, especially, is they seem much more attuned to their mental health and well-being and excited to be out in front about it. This is no longer something taboo. It's a priority. And so, the well-being rankings and offerings and resources, that's, very much front of mind, it seems to me, for a lot of students. And I think that that's only going to serve them well in college. And so I would say that, it's not a topic to be discouraged. If they want to talk a little bit about that in the application, I think there are effective ways of doing that. But I think that's an overall positive change where students know a little bit more about themselves, how they like to learn, what their preferred environments are, where they can best succeed. And that is incredibly useful information in this process. A silver lining.
I think another concern for higher education generally, and I've been reading a little bit about this recently, is just student preparation for college. That obviously through the pandemic, lots changed, and your sons and daughters probably spent significant time in virtual classes over the course of their high school career. And so the outcomes of that, there is starting to be research available that suggests that students entering college this fall are going to be behind peers who enrolled earlier. Faculty at my institution are interested in that. They're concerned about that. And I think colleges are going to have to make some adjustments to support students in that way for the deficiencies that each of us might find at our institutions and with our entering students.
So one of the largest things that we have noticed, and this is not necessarily specific to our office, but just kind of in general in the United States, is that a lot of students decided to apply to more colleges during COVID once a lot of schools moved to test optional admissions requirements. Did you all experience that, and was that more difficult? How did that potentially change any of your evaluation processes? What advice would you give to students kind of moving forward with that in mind? I didn't prepare them with this question.
We're a member of the Common Application that you may have heard of. There are about 1,000 colleges who are members of the Common Application. And before the pandemic, the average student applied through Common App to 4 to 5 colleges. Recently, it's been 5 to 6, and so it's increased, but increased slightly. And I don't know exactly why the pandemic might have increased the number of applications. It could have been because visits weren't as available as they were before, and so you spread your applications a little farther and then try to get to the places that give you a positive response. We've seen increases in applications for a number of years until this year, and then we're slightly behind where we were last year at this time. I don't think that is pandemic related, though.
I'll say we've seen a pretty significant increase in applications pretty much, well, pandemic hit at a strange time, but yes, we are significantly up in applications and also in yield. So it's not necessarily, at least for us, that the students are, these are, potentially less interested applicants. I think it depends a lot on the predictability, or what your feeling is about the predictability of the kind of the landscape. So as a public university in Virginia, our, kind of direct competitors tend to be, your UVA, Virginia Tech, James Madison, and so the less that families are able to kind of predict outcomes within your sort of ecosystem of the most commonly applied to schools, that I think is sort of generating a little anxiety and a little bit more kind of hedging your bets. But I think the policy about more applications does not necessarily mean a happier student during, after, before. That stands. I think one of the benefits of the pandemic is that there are way more virtual offerings where we will allow you to maybe not visit in person before you apply, but because we've got all of these virtual tours and live sessions that might be online in case you can't make it to campus before application. And I think you can still do some pretty good learning about the schools and still having the list of all first choice schools instead of really just casting a super wide net. Because then what if you get into all those places? That's its own kind of headache, right? So however anxious you feel like you might be, I still think the general rules of thumb about how many and how to distribute the, schools that you might be fits for stays the same.
So another big change was obviously this test optional movement. Just for context, before the pandemic, around 20 to 30% of colleges in the U.S. Had test optional admissions. And post-pandemic, those numbers have grown drastically and continue to remain. I think the last stat that I saw was still about 60 to 70% of colleges in the U.S. are now test optional. Has that changed in your offices? And then also, if you are test optional, are you planning to remain test optional in the future?
At my institution, we went test optional 5 years ago, and we studied that possibility for a while, engaged with our faculty also. When students apply to my institution, we recalculate everyone's GPA based on our own scale and ranking. We give an extra quality point for AP courses, and that recalculated GPA is the best predictor of how a student will perform in their first year at my institution. And when we add a test score, SAT or ACT, to that calculation, it didn't improve the predictive validity very much. And so we felt very confident removing testing for students who didn't want to submit their testing prior to the pandemic. Will, in all likelihood, continue to be test optional. I know during the pandemic, students just weren't able to take the test. I'm going to be real curious to see institutions that required testing, if they'll go back to requiring testing. I don't think that many schools will. That was a growing trend prior to the pandemic, and it'll be interesting to see how that change is moving forward.
I'll just add that one thing to keep in mind, so UNC is part of a system of schools. So the decision to be test optional is not campus-based. The state system makes that determination. So currently we are test optional through 24. Whether it gets extended, we've been in conversations with the people who go back to the system to say, people are already asking us, we want to be able to give answers about 25, but there's a lot of different agenda topics, as you can imagine, when you're navigating a whole system of schools. So we are trying to push this issue to get an answer sooner than later. We know the NCAA, I believe, just announced that they're going to be moving completely to leaving testing out of the picture. So there's a lot of momentum, of course, but I think the thing to remember is that these may not all be school-based decisions. Schools will work with what they're allowed to do. And again, currently we are test optional at Carolina. Place I worked before had used testing and went test optional during the pandemic and did re-engineer a little bit. That's maybe too extreme a word, but reimagine how do we evaluate applications. You get to rely on the data you're used to having as one piece. And it's always only been one piece of the puzzle, but you remove it, and sometimes now you realize what kind of a crutch it may have been before. So I think all of us have gotten much better at looking at a lot more of the application. We always looked at all of it, but looking even deeper at those things and looking at the data and trying to figure out what does it really tell us about the use of it. So I wish I had a better answer for what Carolina's going to do. I don't know yet, but we're optional through 24, and the system will help us and help know that. But we are informing the system the best we can. Every time I see a peer school out there that announces their test optional through 25, I send them an email, send them the headline. We'll see where it goes.
And I'm going to add to what Jason just shared. Perfect example right here in your backyard, University of Tennessee. When COVID occurred, we went test optional. But our goal was to be in a pilot format through 2025. Well, our seniors this year were surprised this past summer when all of a sudden we went test inclusive out of nowhere. When we had been communicating with our high school colleagues that we were going to be test optional, it is because the system, the Board of Trustees, said all University of Tennessee campuses were going back test inclusive. You can believe that our admissions team and enrollment officers are watching the data, the performance of our current classes that came in test optional and were admitted without test scores, because we're going to use what little data we do have to still try to validate if we're going to go back test optional. But yeah, that is exactly what happened with us. Our intention was to be test optional, and someone else's hand told us otherwise, and we had to be test inclusive. At the time we were test optional, only 33% of our applicants applied test optional.
I'll dive in really quick. Mason's been test optional since about 2006. We're going to keep riding that train. In the advent of the pandemic, we came up with ways to even do some of our more selective major admissions based on transcripts. So for engineers, computer scientists, we're scrutinizing the math coursework. The nursing direct admit, it's similar with science courses. But we do not need the tests, and that still leaves students eligible for any amount of scholarship we award, any scholarship programs. So we did get a little bit more egalitarian even so.
And just to add to that, so we have two rubrics at my institution for students who apply with testing and students who don't. And the students who don't provide testing, we just place more value in that evaluation on their course selection and on their GPA. The other question that I get a lot is, should I submit my scores to your institution? And I think every institution has their own sort of take on that. But generally, I think colleges report their mid-50% testing. And so the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. And so my advice to students at my institution is, if you're within that range or above it, I recommend that you submit your test scores. If not, then you probably shouldn't. And I think most colleges, not everyone, and there would be exceptions to that, I'm sure, there would be circumstances and situations where a student might submit a score that wasn't in that 25th percentile or above. But generally speaking, and the vast majority of colleges that I know want to report better scores next year than they had the year before. And so if you're above that 25th percentile, generally I would say you want to report your test score.
So you're lucky because your college counselor will advise your student whether or not to submit their test score. Also, there is a session totally on test optional admissions led by Jonathan Webster from Washington and Lee right after this. Okay, so we are about out of time, so I wanted to ask you one last question. What advice would you give to our parents?
Just by a show of hands, how many of you have children in college or already graduated from college? You know, I have to say that enjoy the process is what I say. I loved visiting colleges. I know that I've been in this industry for a long time, but I love visiting colleges with my kids and learning about different institutions. I wanted my kids to enjoy it as much as I did. I'm not sure that they did. They certainly didn't enjoy every visit as much as I did. But I hope that students take a sense of adventure into this decision. For most students, this is the most significant decision that they'll make at this stage of their life. And so I think the way that you encourage and support them in making this decision independently is a great way to lead them into a great college experience.
And I would just put out there, too, and we just released all of our early action decisions on Friday, so maybe this is why it's on my mind. But I think doing your part to be both cheerleader and support, but also with your counseling office, figure out how to keep them grounded about the process they're entering into. What I've said numerous times over the last several days to students and parents has been that the talent is in the student. They're going to take that with them wherever they go. They may not be happy with a decision because they envision themselves on a certain campus doing certain things, but that doesn't determine their success. They determine their success, wherever they choose to take it, okay? That's easier said than done when I'm on this side of the table. But it really is what I mean, because I think when we see the talent in the students, we inevitably, as we talk with apps going up because of test optional or COVID, we have to turn away most of the people who are looking at us. That's not why we got into this business. So we spend a lot of time counseling students after the fact, and I think the more that we can do, like your office does, with them on the front end and say, this looks like how realistic this might be. Do you really understand what it's going to be like to go in there and maybe be told no? What's that going to feel like? And really talking about that, because I think for so many high-achieving students, they don't fail, or they don't not achieve what they strive for because they just work hard enough to get it. And sometimes that's not going to do it for getting into a college. And that's a really hard pill to swallow. But what else could I have done? Nothing. There's nothing else they could have done. They entered a really competitive pool. And I think understanding what that's like is a really hard thing to do, and it's a really hard thing to really grasp the depth of how many wonderful students like yours are out there who probably don't apply to a wide enough range of schools. They're applying to the schools they know by name, these rankings. And so inevitably, space gets tight. And it's not about them, it's about the process. And that's, so preparing them to have that thick skin, not feel judged by it, is really important.
You've seen those bumper tags, House Divided. I love creating those. And I appreciate them because those are parents that, in spite of maybe where they went to school or where their fandom or loyalty may be, they've allowed their son or daughter to go where they want to go. What is the right fit for your student? So I'm all about House Divided. But I'm not against legacy and continuing the tradition as well. Make sure your kids understand it's not personal. It is an emotional roller coaster. But you've got some selective institutions up here, and it's emotional for us. The people on the other side of the phone, the desk, the email, we care, and we're being as thorough as possible with your student. And we unfortunately can't admit every good student. And so just know that it's not personal, and that there are other pathways if it's where your student, son or daughter wants to finish.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm going to let our panelists, I'm going to dismiss y'all, and Meg Connor is in the back, and she can lead you to the pack. And while they are heading out, I'm going to ask that y'all stay here for just a few minutes so I can give you a few additional announcements. The first is we have 10 session offerings, and there's QR codes posted all around the PAC building, and then there's some in the back here if you didn't get that. But I would encourage you, if you're here with multiple people, to divide and conquer. There's probably multiple sessions that you would like to see. If you don't get to see it tonight, you can always watch the recording. We will be recording in each room, so don't be too upset if you don't get to. But I will say, if you arrive at a session and it's just too overcrowded, I would ask that you return to that session maybe the second or third time. But we will post all the recordings to my Baylor later. Also, and this might be the hardest thing, we are going to be swooping our guests to dinner right after the end of the program. So we ask that you just kind of let them go when they're done with their program. And also, your students will get an opportunity to talk to them one-on-one tomorrow. We have invited all juniors, so you can encourage them to arrive early tomorrow morning and come and speak to any or all of our guests tomorrow at 8:20, and that will be in the private dining room. But we do ask that you respect their time and just kind of let them head out so they can go and enjoy dinner as we thank them for coming to our institution. That is all we have for you, so you can go ahead and head over to the PAC. Thank you.